The town of Redwood Falls looked peaceful from a distance, with white wooden houses, tidy lawns, and American flags hanging gently in the evening wind, but peace in small towns often survived only because no one asked the right questions, and Avery Collins learned this the night she returned after 15 years away, a night when the fog settled low and, thick like the town itself, was trying to hide something it never wanted revealed. Avery parked her car near the old gas station that had been abandoned since her childhood and sat there longer than she planned, gripping the steering wheel, listening to the ticking engine, trying to slow her breathing because coming back here was never part of her dream. And yet here she was, pulled in by a single phone call from a stranger who only said your sister didn't just disappear, before hanging up. Her sister Emma had gone missing when Avery was 23 and Emma was 17. The case was closed within weeks, labeled a runaway, and over time, even Avery was pressured to accept it, but that pressure never killed the feeling that something was wrong. It only buried it deep until tonight. Avery stepped out of the car, and the cold air hit her face harder than expected, carrying the smell of wet trees and rust. Everything looked smaller than she remembered, except the silence, which felt heavier than ever. The town lights glowed warmly, but somehow failed to touch the darker corners where memory lived. Inside the local motel, the clerk looked up slowly when Avery gave her name, and there was a flicker of recognition that vanished too quickly, proving something. Avery had always known people here remembered more than they admitted and pretended harder than anyone else. She took the key without speaking and climbed the stairs, where the carpet smelled old and tired, just like the lies that had been recycled in this place for years. That night sleep never came, and sometime after midnight, she heard footsteps outside her door, not hurried, not accidental, but measured, as if someone was standing there listening, just like she was. Avery held her breath, waiting for a knock that never came, and when morning finally arrived, she found something on the ground outside her door, a small sealed envelope with no name, just one sentence, typed clean and cruel. "Stop asking about Emma." Avery stared at the paper until her hands began to shake, because that message confirmed what the police never did. Emma's disappearance was never random, and someone in Redwood Falls was still watching, still guarding a truth that refused to stay buried. And Avery knew then that coming back had already sealed her fate, because she was no longer searching for answers. The answers had started looking back. Morning arrived slowly in Redwood Falls, like the town itself was reluctant to wake up, and Avery noticed how quiet everything felt. No morning rush, no doors opening, no children waiting for school buses, just a stillness that pressed against her chest as she stepped outside the motel and walked toward her car, holding the envelope in her coat pocket like it was a living thing. She drove straight to the police station, a low brick building she remembered too well because it was the same place she had begged for answers 15 years ago, and walking through its doors felt less like entering a station and more like stepping into a preserved lie time had refused to touch. The officer at the desk was young, polite, and completely unaware of the history that lived in those walls, and when Avery asked for records related to Emma Collins, he hesitated just long enough to tell her everything she needed to know before saying the file was archived and might take time to retrieve. Time Redwood Falls had always claimed it needed. Avery left without arguing, knowing resistance here was never loud. It was quiet, passive, patient, and dangerous. Instead, she drove toward the edge of town, where the trees thickened and memory sharpened, because this was where Emma had last been seen walking home from her part-time job at the diner. The building still stood, though newer paint failed to hide its age, and inside, the waitress at the counter froze for half a second when Avery mentioned Emma's name before forcing a sympathetic smile that didn't reach her eyes and saying everyone thought she just wanted a different life. Avery asked one simple question: did anyone ever actually see her leave town? The diner went silent. Plates paused midair, coffee stopped pouring, and that silence told Avery more than any answer could, and when she turned to leave, she felt it again, that sensation of being watched, followed, measured, and deliberate, just like the footsteps outside her motel room. By midday, Avery noticed the town was reacting, not openly, but indirectly. Conversations ended when she entered rooms, strangers looked away too quickly, cars slowed near her then sped up, and every instinct she had built since losing her sister screamed that she needed to be careful because she was no longer looking for the truth. She was disturbing it. Back at her motel room, Avery found her door unlocked, though she was certain she had locked it, and inside nothing was stolen, nothing was broken, but her bag had been opened, and her phone moved just enough to prove someone had been there, not to steal, but to remind her she wasn't alone. Her phone buzzed a moment later from a number with no name. "You were warned." Her hands shook as anger replaced fear because whoever was doing this had spent years feeling protected, and she suddenly understood Emma hadn't vanished because no one cared. Emma vanished because someone powerful had cared far too much. As night fell, Avery sat in her car watching the police station from across the street, and that was when she saw him, the same man who led her sister's investigation 15 years ago. Now older, heavier, but unmistakable Sheriff Daniel Price, stepping out, locking the door, and glancing around like a man who knew secrets had a way of circling back. And in that moment, Avery made a decision that would change everything. She would stop asking questions and start following answers. That night, Avery followed Sheriff Daniel Price from a distance, her headlights off, as she kept her car just far enough back to blend into the emptiness of Redwood Falls, and the deeper he drove, the farther he went from the polished center of town until streetlights vanished and the road thinned into a stretch of cracked asphalt swallowed by trees. Price turned onto an old access road that Avery recognized instantly because it led toward the abandoned quarry where she and Emma used to ride bikes as kids, and the memory tightened something in her chest because this was not a place people visited by accident. She parked behind a line of dead trees and watched as Price stepped out of his truck, moving with the confidence of someone who had done this many times before, and when he disappeared into the darkness, Avery almost stayed in her car, almost listened to the voice telling her to leave, but fear had lost its grip the moment she realized Emma's story was still alive. Avery followed on foot, careful with every step, until she saw a faint light flickering through the quarry building windows and voices, low, controlled, secret, and through a broken pane, she saw not criminals, not strangers, but familiar faces, men who ran businesses, men who sponsored school events, men who filled the front pews on Sundays, and the realization hit her harder than any threat message ever could. This wasn't one man's secret. It was a town's. Avery stepped back slowly, heart pounding as she retraced her steps, but a sudden click echoed behind her, the unmistakable sound of a weapon being lifted, and a voice she remembered from a lifetime ago said, "You should have stayed gone." She turned and saw Sheriff Price standing there alone, flashlight aimed directly at her eyes, blinding her long enough for fear to regain its voice, and Price stepped closer, calm, controlled, and disappointed, not surprised, and said Emma wasn't supposed to disappear the way she did. She just saw something she shouldn't have, and when she wouldn't forget, people panicked. Avery's breath caught when she realized her sister hadn't been taken randomly, she had been erased. Price lowered the flashlight slightly, and his tone shifted, softened, as he said, "Leaving town is still an option for you too. Some doors, when open, stay open forever." For a moment, Avery considered it, then she felt something stronger than fear rise in her chest, anger, grief, and the unbearable weight of 15 years of unanswered love, and as she said, "I'm not leaving without her truth." Price stared at her for a long moment, calculating, then stepped aside slowly, revealing her car parked untouched, like a gesture of mercy or a warning. She couldn't tell, and as she drove away, she understood that she had crossed an invisible line, and from this moment forward there would be no more threats. Only actions. By morning, Avery woke to the sound of sirens in the distance, and the news playing softly on her phone reported an accidental fire overnight at the old quarry building, describing it as a tragic loss of abandoned property, but Avery knew better. It wasn't an accident. It was an erasure attempt. But they were too late. Because Avery wasn't running anymore. She was hunting. Avery did not return to the motel after the quarry fire. Instead, she drove until dawn, painted the empty highway silver, and pulled over near the edge of town where the trees opened just enough to give her room to think, because sleep had become impossible and fear no longer felt useful. She understood now why Emma had vanished. It was not because she was weak or reckless, but because she had been brave enough to notice something that others were paid not to see, and that realization shifted Avery's grief into something sharper, more dangerous, and focused. Her first real mistake would be trusting the wrong person, so she chose carefully and went to someone with nothing to lose, a retired journalist named Frank Holloway, whose name she found buried deep online, connected to an article from 20 years ago about missing teens that had mysteriously never been published. Frank lived on the outskirts of town in a weathered house stacked ridiculously high with newspapers, notebooks, and silence, and when Avery said Emma's name, Frank closed his eyes like someone hearing a ghost return, and after a long moment, he said, "I tried to stop it once, and they shut me down." Frank revealed that years ago several girls had gone missing across nearby counties, always ruled as runaways and always closed quickly, and every report that pointed elsewhere died in the same way, quietly and permanently. And when Avery showed him the envelope threat, his expression hardened because it matched letters he had received years earlier, before his career collapsed. Frank gave Avery a flash drive containing old interviews, witness statements, and one partially burned photo recovered from the quarry years ago. It showed Emma standing near the same red utility truck Avery remembered from her own nightmares. Proof. But proof was only powerful if it survived. When Avery returned to her car, she found the windshield smashed, the flash drive gone, and her phone ringing endlessly from an unknown number, and she knew instantly they had followed her, had been waiting, and now wanted to make sure nothing left Redwood Falls alive. She drove straight out of town, no stops, no detours, and pulled over miles later, hands shaking so badly she had to sit in silence, just to breathe, and that was when she used the one contact she had avoided until now, a federal investigator named Lucas Reed, who owed her family a favor long buried and longer unpaid. She sent him a single message: "I have evidence about a multi-year disappearance cover-up in Redwood Falls, and I may not survive the night." His reply came 30 seconds later: "Stay where you are." As Avery waited, she watched the road behind her and realized something else terrifying. They never chased her, which meant they were confident she couldn't escape. And that meant the final move hadn't been played yet. The sound of tires on gravel broke the silence before Avery ever saw the headlights, and when they finally appeared cutting through the dark highway, her muscles locked, unsure whether relief or fear should come first. But when the unmarked SUV slowed and a man stepped out holding his hands open, she knew this was no longer just her fight. Lucas Reed looked nothing like the men who had watched her for days. His clothes were plain, his voice controlled, but his eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen too many truths buried and left to rot. And when he listened to Avery tell everything, he didn't interrupt even once, and that silence was the confirmation she needed, because shock would have meant disbelief. But Lucas already understood what kind of town Redwood Falls was. By sunrise, federal vehicles rolled quietly into town, no sirens, no announcements, just presence, and the moment word spread, the mood changed. Doors stayed shut, curtains moved, and people who once smiled now studied each other like strangers, and Avery walked past familiar streets, realizing this is what fear looked like when it finally turned inward. The first arrest came before noon, and it wasn't Sheriff Price. It was the diner owner, then the local contractor, then a school board member. Each name sent a ripple through the town like a crack spreading across glass, and with every arrest, Avery understood something painful. Emma hadn't been taken by one monster, she had been sacrificed to protect many. Sheriff Price tried to control the narrative. He spoke to cameras, smiling, calling it a misunderstanding, claiming outside forces were exaggerating, but his voice cracked when Lucas Reed stepped behind him and placed a hand on his shoulder and whispered something that drained every drop of color from his face, and in that moment the strongest man in Redwood Falls became small. Price was taken in quietly, without resistance, like someone who had known all along how this would end. Inside a secure room, Avery watched him avoid her eyes, and that hurt more than rage, because it confirmed something she had feared. Emma was never seen as expendable. Because she was alone, she was silenced, because she was right. Evidence poured in once the silence broke. People talked not because they were brave, but because fear had changed sides, and one witness finally said what Avery had waited 15 years to hear. Emma had tried to leave town after threatening to go public, and the truck took her to the river road, where no cameras existed. No remains were found, but truth was. As night fell, Avery stood outside alone, listening to the sound of helicopters above, and for the first time, she didn't feel hunted. She felt empty, drained, hollow, and heavier than she ever imagined justice would feel, and she realized then that closure wasn't a gift, it was a wound that finally stopped bleeding because everything she loved had been shaped by a lie. But one question still echoed inside her. Where is Emma? And she knew the answer was waiting somewhere the town had buried deepest. The river road stretched longer than Avery remembered, silent and forgotten, cutting through trees that leaned inward as if guarding what had been hidden there for years, and she stood at its edge while federal floodlights painted the darkness white and cold, and even with all the officers around her she felt alone, because this part was no longer about justice, it was about goodbye. They found the truck first buried under branches and rusted metal where the road dipped low, and when they pulled it free, Avery felt her knees weaken because she had imagined this moment so many times, but reality carried a weight imagination never could, and while the truck held no remains, it held something else: Emma's necklace wrapped around the gear shift, like someone had placed it there on purpose, not to hide but to remember. Avery held it in her hands, the metal cold against her skin, and in that moment she finally understood that Emily had never fully left. She had resisted, she had connected, that she had tried to escape, and even though her body was never recovered, her truth had survived long enough for Avery to finish what she started. The official report would say Emma Collins died under unknown circumstances. Her case reopened and validated, and the town of Redwood Falls would never be able to erase that line from its history again. And while some people were sentenced, others resigned, quietly vanished into obscurity, carrying their shame like a permanent shadow. And the town itself would never sound the same at night again, because silence, once broken, never returns untouched. Weeks later, Avery walked through the town one last time, not as a visitor, not as an investigator, but as someone finally free from unanswered questions, and people looked away not because they blamed her, but because she reminded them of what happens when comfort is built on denial and fear. Before leaving, she stopped at the diner one final time, the counter empty, the lights dim, and placed Emma's necklace inside a small envelope, leaving it behind like closure offered, not demanded. And as she stepped outside, the wind moved gently through the street. For the first time in years, it didn't feel threatening, it felt honest. Avery drove away without looking back, knowing that healing was not forgetting but carrying truth forward. And months later, when a journalist released a long report exposing similar patterns in other towns, Avery read it quietly and smiled through tears, because something bigger than her grief had been born. A warning. The final narration fades as Avery's voice echoes softly in memory, saying some towns survive on silence, but silence is only powerful until someone decides to speak. And that choice will always belong to the brave.